The Cuban flag flies again in Washington, D.C. At a ceremony today, the Cuban national anthem was played and 3 Cuban soldiers in uniform raised the flag at the newly opened Cuban embassy, while several hundred people cheered at the gathering. But not everybody is cheering out there. Soledad Cedro of the Libre Initiative is here to discuss. Soledad, thank you so much for being with us and welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being with you today.
Tell us, what is your organization's position on the opening of the Cuban embassy today?
Well, our position is the same one that we've been having for the past couple of years. Actually, for the last 50 years, not the organization. It's not such an old organization, but everybody who wants freedom and democracy. Nothing changed in Cuba today. Today we have a new embassy in the United States. Today we've seen a flag being raised in the United States, a Cuban flag, but still in Cuba there is no democracy, there's no respect for freedom, there's no respect for human rights. Everyone who opposes the government in Cuba, this dictatorship, the longest dictatorship in history, everyone who is talking against that dictatorship or who's opposing the dictatorship is risking its life. Things haven't changed in Cuba. The only thing that changed is that the Obama administration made once again a unilateral concession to the Cuban regime.
Do the people in Cuba on the ground being oppressed by this tyrannical dictatorship, do they understand that the rank and file Americans don't want this?
It's hard to say because we don't have access to true information in Cuba.
That's what I
thought. The government controls absolutely everything. So on the one hand, they control what people read and what people see because there's no way to have free press on the island. And on the other hand, they are also controlling what is getting out of the island. We receive the information that the Cuban government wants us to receive. There is so many few possibilities of really knowing what is going on the island because the government controls it all.
How big of a loss does this feel like, Soledad? Because at least the people had the leverage of the fact that the United States, it wasn't doing business with Cuba, but now that they are, and we know this money is going to go straight to the regime in control at this point, whatever money is made from this agreement. And so how big of a loss are people feeling there in Cuba?
Well, the thing is that there's an embargo and it's a law. So fortunately, as it is a law, in order to change it, we need the Congress to make that change. It's not something that the Obama administration is going to be able to do on their own terms. So it's not going to be so easy to sell and to buy things from Cuba and to Cuba. But there are going to be certain flexibilities because this administration has been working in order to flexibilize things with Cuba without asking them anything in return. And as you were saying, it's terrible because it's not that we are going to be sending money or sending products to the Cuban people. It's only going to be something that we are going to be doing, or the United States is going to be doing with the Cuban regime. Now, it was a regime that it was pretty much dying. Why? Because most of its income was coming from Venezuela. And Venezuela right now is under a very complicated economic situation. Now that the Venezuelan regime is not being able to provide the dollars that the Cuban regime needs, it's the United States the one who is going to provide that air. It doesn't seem any logic at all.
No, it really doesn't. And most of the Republican candidates for president have said they would reverse it if they become president. But this probably doesn't even help because most people in Cuba, rank and file people on the streets, we call it Main Street in America. I don't know what you call it in Cuba, but they probably don't even realize that there is kind of hope at the end of this if there is a new administration in place.
Absolutely, because they don't receive free information. So as long as the government is the one controlling everything that people are reading and listening on the island, we are not going to be able to explain our point to them.
And what does it really mean in real terms for Cuban people that now there's a Cuban embassy in America? What does that really mean?
Absolutely nothing. What it's going to change in a Cuban person, someone who lives in Havana or who lives in Matanzas or anywhere in Cuba, how is his or her life going to change today now that they have an embassy in the United States? Nothing. They are still going to have trouble finding what to eat, because in Cuba the problem goes to the extent of people not having even food on their tables. They are not going to be able to be free to think and say what they think. They are not going to be free to choose what they want to work on or what they want to study. They are not going to be free to choose what to listen to. So everyday Cuban people nothing have changed for them. They still have a very, very cruel dictatorship governing them for over 50 years. And now they only have an embassy here in which they are going to spend a lot of money. And we are going to have probably many people coming from Cuba, not the good people that we see every day that are coming from Cuba trying to make a better living here in the United States, but people who are going to be working for the Cuban government, who are trained by the Cuban government, and now they are going to be living here in the United States freely with their passports and their visas.
And, you know, this administration has talked a lot, Soledad, about human rights. And yet there seemed to be no bearing whatsoever. You know, I mean, to begin some of this, to open this embassy, the administration could have said, hey, you know, we want some human rights changes in Cuba, but they didn't even bother to do that. And yet they continue to talk about human rights as if that's a priority for them. Where do you think this disconnect is?
Well, we've seen in this administration several times that one thing is what they are saying and a very different thing is what they are doing. They told us to take it to a domestic issue. They told us that we were going to have a better health system, and now we've seen what happened with Obamacare. Right. They told us that we would be able to keep our doctors and we were going to pay less money for our health. And now we've seen that everything got higher and that we are no longer able to keep our doctors. So same thing is going on with the Cuban case. They are telling us, oh, yes, we are super interested in human rights. But on the other hand, we've seen that they made unilateral concessions to the Cuban regime, and they don't care that even today, no, I'm not saying a year ago, a month ago, no, today. The day when they were opening an embassy here, the day when we saw Secretary John Kerry talking and saying that this was a historic day, there were people, dissidents on the island that have been arrested because they were on the streets protesting against
Oh my goodness. Government. Oh my goodness. Well, we're going to keep fighting for it, Soledad, and I know there are a lot of people out here that feel exactly like you and I do. Thank you for being with us.